The green is hiding under here. I just had to model something red today, so I've hidden it. Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Now I did mention when I was making the aqua and gold version of the bodice that I wore in the Arcana lookbook with its matching long skirt that I wanted to make a more day wear version of that bodice that looked more like a jacket for wearing out and about during the day. Something less shiny and something like a matte pique maybe, which is what this dress is made out of actually. It's a nice matte fabric. But I forgot how stretchy this pique is. I have some of it in black here in my stash and I pulled it out and it's just too stretchy to make this rather structured garment out of, so I decided to go in a different direction. And in keeping with the original idea of doing something more subdued and day wear, I decided on a sparkly black brocade. But before I could dive into fabric, I did still have a few small changes I wanted to make to this pattern, so let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. Now, to address the elephant in the room, yes, this is a blue table of doom, but it's not the usual surface we're used to looking at. I will say that the blue table is underneath this new topper, but we just have this blue wood grain surface in between us and the table right now, okay? And we're just gonna, all will be explained eventually, all right? And we're gonna stick with that. But I've grabbed my pattern for this project, and I'm going to go ahead and start by adding 3/4 of an inch onto the hem of my undersleeve because I want to make these sleeves a little bit longer and a little bit larger just because I was disappointed with the amount of puff that first time. I wanted to make these even more puffed this time. So I'm going to add 2 more lines and 2 more wedges of fullness to the outer puff sleeve here as well. Again, if you missed my first video on this bodice project, I will link that in a card so you can see how I made the first aqua and gold sort of taffeta-ish, like metallic polyester taffeta version of this that I made for Arcana. So you can watch me make the original pattern there. I'm just going to be making tweaks here today. So just adding in these wedges of fullness to start, and then we'll add on a little bit of length to this. So overall this adds in about 1 inch along the sleeve cap, and then, I don't know, maybe 5 inches down here along the hem of the sleeve. And I will redraw this a good inch longer as well, and dips down a little bit further in the back than I did originally as well. So taping on my spare paper here. Lots of scraps. I did in the end have to buy another roll of alphanumeric paper, by the way. This one isn't running out, but I'm starting to get too close. So I was hoping to not have to buy another roll before I moved, but you know, who knows when that will be. So it's all very up in the air. I can't run out of paper here. Too much pattern drafting gets done in this room. So I ended up getting another roll. The thing about pattern drafting paper is that the roll of pattern drafting paper weighs like as much as a tree. You know, it's a very large, long roll of paper. So it's very heavy and therefore costs more to ship to me than it does for the paper itself. But it does last a long time, even for me, and I do a lot of pattern drafting. So if a more normal person ordered a roll of pattern paper, I think it would last like half a lifetime. But for me, of course, not so much. But I've taped down my floops and added on a good inch to this sleeve pattern and dipped it down about maybe, I don't know, another 2 inches right in the center back. So just even more floop and puff for that particular sleeve here. Now here's my bodice front. I just wanted to actually modify this so that instead of the front being pointed like this, it actually kind of just squares off and looks a little bit more like an actual jacket, just to give this a little bit less of a costumey touch. So I'm just going to bring this center front down and square it off so that it will meet up with the rest of the bodice and really make this look a little bit more like a jacket as opposed to some sort of evening bodice, weird historical inspired thing. It's still going to look very historically inspired in the end, I promise. This kind of reminds me of the doublets that Orlando wears in the movie Orlando with Tilda Swinton, which I actually just saw a couple months ago, and it's so atmospheric and good, and I'm sad that I hadn't seen it before. It was like watching a hazy dream in a good way. But Orlando, they wear a couple of nice black and shiny doublets in the sort of 16th century parts of that movie, and I appreciated all the costumes in that movie. They were all very epic. But yes, I will just square this off as opposed to having it pointed in the front. But I'm not making this as long as the peplum piece is, so this will still have a little bit of visual interest going on in the front here. It just won't be pointed any longer. Princess seam will still match up, no problem there. Now actually for the back of this, I'm going to redraft a new back because I want to move the dart over first before I make it into a princess seam like I did the first time. So I'm actually going to draft a whole new center back and side back piece for this. So let me grab some paper here and trace a new copy of my bodice block back to work from. Trace in the original dart that I'll move over today, and then I'll grab some of the details from the first back I had drafted for this project, transfer the shoulder and the collar over onto this new tracing, and then I'll start making some adjustments. I do only need the 1/2 inch along the center back of this. So making sure to have 1/2 inch seam allowance along the center back instead of that 1 inch, because I'm not going to be cutting this on the fold. I'm not going to be doing a center back zipper, but I will have a center back seam. So leaving a 1/2 inch along the center back here. Just making sure my collar remains the same as that first version, because we like a nice pointed back of the collar. Feels very villainous, of course. Now, I just wanted to move this princess seam over towards the center back to give it a little bit more of a flattering, narrowing shape. I just thought that the back of the original garment could be pushed further, so that's what I'm going to do here. Oh, making sure to extend the side seam that 1/4 inch that I had the first time and lower that arm side 1/2 inch like I had the first one, just so that everything still matches up once I start sewing this together with the rest of the pattern. Because although this is a new back pattern, it still needs to fit in with the rest. I'm just basically moving over the princess seam line, but instead of having to tape, like cut apart and tape together that old pattern piece, I just wanted to have a fresh copy. So I'm moving my dart over towards the center back, a good 1.5 inches here. I'll just close the original dart and swing that over from the pivot point on the back, like so. Fill this dart in. We've just moved the dart. You can always move your darts, even here on the back where there is no bust. On the front, we always move things from the apex. Here in the back, I just move things from the pivot point, the end of the dart. But I can put this dart anywhere. I'm just putting it closer to the center back so that when I draw in my princess seam using this as a guide, it's far closer to the center back than the original one. Comes in at a more acute angle towards the center back, as opposed to the first bodice back that I made. But now that I moved that dart, of course I am going to cut this apart. Cut the dart fullness away and add seam allowance like I would for any princess seam. So really just moving that dart temporarily. Sometimes I will do extra steps while I'm demonstrating, just so that you can get a better idea of what's happening if you're newer to pattern drafting. But I'm adding my seam allowance in along this new style line along the back, the princess seam of the back. Using my scraps for that, taping down my floops on the back so it doesn't get caught on anything. Some people think this is a waste of tape, but if you've ever had your pattern pieces, because they are scraggly on the back, get caught on something and then tear and rip, that's more annoying. So I'd rather tape down my floops. So here's my new back and side back. Just have an extra bit of paper here. Get out. And now I will have this narrow further in the back, and everything will still fit together because I traced all the markings. And the one last modification I wanted to make to this pattern from last time was to go ahead and make the little over sleeve cap, the last layer of sleeve. There's way too many layers on these sleeves, honestly. And I'm using a thicker fabric today, so I will be able to, I'll feel the thickness of it all later when I'm trying to sew it all together. But I just wanted to make that a little bit larger, so I just exaggerated that little cap a little bit as well. Then I was, going to cut this out of PK, decided against that. I tried laying it out on some matte black wool, but I only had 1 yard of the wool, and it just wouldn't fit, not with these peplum pieces and the large sleeves and stuff like that. So I had to go for something else, and what did I have sitting in the stash? Sparkly black brocade, so no one's really that surprised to see me working with a shiny brocade, especially in black, but here we are. I know, it's rather daywear friendly, as I said. This fabric isn't necessarily thin, but it was rather lightweight, or not really like heavy enough to make a jacket out of, so I did want to go ahead and interline this. So I cut all my pieces out of the black shiny brocade, and then also out of a cotton muslin so that I could interline everything for this jacket, which of course again helped add some bulk where I wanted it, and also where I didn't want it, unfortunately, in the sleeves. But I only have about 1 yard of black silk organza in the stash right now, and I think I need to use it for something else. I don't remember off the top of my head for what, but I have lots of plans, and I think it's planned for something else, so I didn't want to cut into my organza for the sleeves. It would have been just slightly lighter weight and slightly thinner when it came time to layer all these things closed up into the arm side, but it's alright. I made it work with the muslin. It just did require some basting, which you'll see later. But everything is cut out, and I'm just lining up all my pieces with their muslin interlining, wrong sides together, I guess, in that way. Not that muslin has a side. And when I do this sort of interlining technique with a finer fabric, like a silk dupioni, like you've seen me do, or with any silk or wool, usually I would hand baste the interlining down. But because this fabric, this is a lurex brocade, likes to fray quite a lot. So before it started fraying apart, I wanted to serge the raw edges anyhow, so I figured I would just baste the muslin on as I did that. So killing 2 birds with 1 stone here, basting my muslin layer on, and encasing the raw edges so they don't keep fraying apart. And now that my pieces are all interlined, I can go ahead and start assembling this jacket. So I'm going to sew the center back seam first here. I'm going to sew up to about where the original neckline on my block would be, and leave the rest of that open so that these little points in the collar and the back stick up and are quite fun and villainous in the back. Then I need to mark my notches around the bust on my front pieces here for the front princess seam, just so that I can line that up around the bust later when I sew this. This will be one of the last seams I sew after I assemble the rest of the bodice, because the center front piece here, it extends down past the waist, so I can't sew this center front piece onto the rest until the peplum is on to the rest of the garment. So you'll see what I mean in the order of operations later. And I can actually start sewing my peplum pieces, the lower part of the jacket, together as well. So I'm pinning those together along this side seams, which is just slightly curved. Again, these peplum pieces are drafted based off my A-line skirt pattern, which of course you've seen me do that technique quite a lot. I actually have some extra poster boards sitting around here in the studio, so I should go ahead and trace the top of my A-line skirt pattern, like the first 10 inches or so, because I use it so often to make peplums that it would be really useful to have a card version laying about. And then I did mark on my sleeves where I needed to put gathering stitching in, so that I can come over here on the machine and put large gathering stitching along both the top of the sleeve cap and the sleeve hems. So you'll see that today as well. But here I am sewing the center back seam of my jacket. The first seam, the first stitching going in for this project. And those side seams for the peplum next, just using my 12 stitches per inch over here on the 99K and regular Gutermann all-purpose thread, as are pretty usual for me. I did put a brand new needle in here just because Lurex Brocade is sensitive, and you'll notice today I'm trying to remember to take my pins out as I go as much as possible, just because, again, any dulling of this needle really affects a Lurex Brocade. So that's just something I've learned. Something about sparkly brocades is they can be a bit sensitive because Lurex threads are, if you can imagine, like a party ribbon for like wrapping a present, only on a very tiny scale. It's not the same as a regular fiber. So I've learned that because I'm sewing with basically tinsel, that they're very sensitive and you gotta have the sharpest needle possible. But I will press open my center back seam, and then I can sew my center backs down onto my side backs, like so here. Pin this back princess seam. Of course it's curved, but only subtly, so it's no problem really. And back over on the machine to sew that first side, and we'll do each side individually here. And a little note about these pins, I actually have been trying to find pins that I actually like for a while now. These are actually Japanese glass-headed pins, and I can link these below because I've really been enjoying these most out of the several different types of pins I tried last year. These are not as long as I like. I like pins a little bit longer usually, but these have been the most consistently like sharp and not too thin so they don't bend too quickly. So yes, I can link these below for any of you who have been on the hunt for a new pin to try, because these have been my favorite so far. But also the other side back seam the same way. And then I'm actually not going to clip my curves until after I sew the side seams as well, just because, again, this fabric likes to fray, so I want to clip as late in the process as possible. So I'm going to clip and press those after I sew these side seams as well. And of course, when I bring that back over here onto the ironing board, I will actually remember to use my clapper and help me press those open. Of course, no clips are needed in these nice straight side seams, but these curves along the back will need a little bit of clipping to lay nice and smooth. So I'm going to grab my scissors and just clip that seam along the curved portion. The portion closer to the waist is not curved, so I don't need to clip down there. But up here I shall, and then I'll press it open and then discover if I need to cut triangles out of the like concave side of this. Hopefully that makes sense. You'll see me here. There's parts where, even though this is clipped, the fabric overlaps. So on this side, I'm cutting little triangles out of where I had clipped the seam. The thing about a princess seam is it's got a curve going in either direction. So on one side you need triangles, on one side you need clips. Sometimes I'm thorough enough to do both like this. I'm telling you, I'm working my way up to tailoring, just slowly but surely. All right. All right, so here's what we have so far. Now, again, I had already sewn my side seams for my peplum pieces, but I did want to sew about, I don't know, 1.5 inches of the center backs together as well. So I'll go ahead and do that and come back. Just stitch that real fast here. And then I can line up that center back seam with the center back of the rest of the bodice, line up my side seams, and then pin in between. I like to pin anchor points together first, or notches together first, and then make everything fit in between, just in case any parts of my project have stretched just from, the time I cut them out to now, because I know my pattern is accurate, so I want to make sure that everything fits back together properly, I guess. But I will sew my waist seam next, over here on the machine, of course. And we have some nice blue lighting over here by the machine today. All different colors of lighting. We know how I love an LED. And because this waist seam is slightly curved, I did go ahead and put some clips in here just because I have 2 layers of wovens in here, and it would just lay better if the seam was clipped. Sometimes if you have something that's loosely woven enough, you don't have to clip the waist seam, but in this particular fabric combination, I felt it would be useful for full smoothness, so I went ahead and clipped those open, and then I can start sewing on my final bodice piece, the center fronts. So I'm going to grab those, and again, I had already marked around the bust notches earlier, so I can line those up first and then pin everything else so I can sew these center front pieces on this front princess seam. This is that princess seam where instead of going into the arm side or the shoulder, it goes into the neckline area, which is an easier princess seam to sew because you're not doing a convex to a concave. It just like lines up nicely. So this is the easiest princess seam to sew and the only one that doesn't have its own name because it's not an armhole princess, it's not a shoulder princess, it's like a neckline princess. Although I've never seen it called that. I mean, I assume that's what it's called. If it has a name, that's what it's called. And of course I will pin and stitch on the other side the exact same way here. Again, you can see this waist seam on the rest of the jacket is already together, and I needed to have the rest of the jacket and that waist seam sewn before I could put this front piece on. This is how I do a lot of jackets actually, where the center front pieces are smooth at the waist and then attached to something with a waist seam for the rest of the garment. I can't usually eliminate the waist seam along the sides because of the amount of curve I have going on or amount of dartfulness I need for my particular shape, depending on the shape of person. It's easier or harder to eliminate that seam. It is possible, it just requires making a like torso length block, which is just not my favorite thing to do, so I've done it once or twice, and I need to do it more here in the future, but not for this particular project today, thankfully. And I will go ahead and clip my curves over the bust and at the waist on this front seam for each side, and again press this open using my tailor's ham for assistance here, and occasionally running out of water and therefore steam and having to go refill this. I actually have too much stuff blocking the sink in this room, so I have to go get water outside of this room and bring it back for the iron at this point, which is not the most convenient thing ever, but you do what you gotta do when you have too much stuff in your studio and not enough space. I'm very lucky to have this sewing room and to have a lot of space, but it is not actually enough because, let's face it, sewing and collecting fabric are like my full-time job, so this room is... I have outgrown this room, alas, sadly enough. But hopefully soon I'll be in a whole new house with plenty of space to spread out all my stuff. But with my front princess seam sewn, I can line up my shoulder seams, including this little tip up for the kind of collar, grown-on collar for this particular project. And I can go ahead and stitch those as well. And that will need to be clipped as well because that little curve here near the neckline is very curvy and therefore needs a couple of clips to lay smooth. And this does have space built in for some shoulder pads, and I don't think I actually put them into the other garment. I don't remember if I actually put them in. But I will end up putting some shoulder padding into this version today, which again, really, this is a very shoulder and with the puff sleeves heavy garment, so I kind of have to balance it out with either a hat or, with a big hairdo would be good, but I don't have enough hair to do that right now. So I had to go with a hat to kind of balance out the amount of shoulder going on with this one. But of course, I don't mind a large shoulder, seeing as I'm a devotee of the 1940 shoulder pad situation. And I have to finally start thinking about putting some sleeves in here, or at least constructing them, so I'm putting my gathering stitching in along the sleeve cuffs and the sleeve caps. And then I hadn't cut out the undersleeve yet, so I grabbed some random waxed cotton poplin that I have laying around in here, cut the undersleeves out of that, and went ahead and pressed those and sewed the underarm seam for those undersleeves. A lot of under going on there. And then I will sew the underarm seam for the outer sleeve as well. The outer sleeve is much larger than the undersleeve. The undersleeve provides structure for the amount of puff that I'm going to be putting on top of it. I learned how to do this double layer of puffage when making the Mandragora gown and working on those 1890s projects. But of course I need to press open those underarm seams once they are sewn, like so. You can see all my threads here for all the gathering stitching that's sitting, waiting to be used here. And these are my undersleeves. So let's grab, hopefully, the correct one of each here. The left and the left and the right and the right. Put those right sides together and pin the underarm seams together along the cuff of the sleeve, for lack of a better term, I suppose. There isn't a separate cuff on this, but you know what I mean. The hem of the sleeve, even though that ends right above my elbow, basically. Then I'll pin the center of each side together and then gather everything down to fit in between. So once again, pinning the anchor points, the underarm seam and the center, before I then pin everything else. And especially I want to distribute my gathers evenly along this area on both sides, so making sure to have a couple of anchor points so I don't get too lost in here and nothing ends up too gathered on the back and not gathered enough on the front, or vice versa. And again, because I have interlined this lightweight but still slightly puffy brocade, this is a lot to get down in here, but probably worth it in the end for a giant puffy sleeve, of course. But because this was so much fabric jam-packed in here, I actually did end up hand basting this, just so that things didn't move around while I was trying to sew this. I felt like I felt nervous, so I wanted to go ahead and baste this into place. It's not something that normally happens to me, so I just taking big stitches and stitching this prematurely with a couple of strands of thread here, just so that everything will hopefully behave over here on the machine. And I did make sure this was gathering side down to the feed dogs, just because if you have something where you're gathering a large amount of fabric into something smaller, or even just have a little bit of extra ease on one side as compared to the other, it's good to put the larger side towards the feed dogs. Most machines, that is what helps ease things together. So I made sure that I had gathering side down while I was sewing this. And again, most machines you can take off a portion of the front of the machine, like a more modern machine, to be able to get inside sleeve cuffs and stuff. And I can't do any of that with this Singer 99K from the 50s, but she's very reliable otherwise. So this machine has other qualities that I value more, But once that is sewn together, I can flip the undersleeve underneath the outer sleeve, now that we are quite puffed here. There we go. Tuck the undersleeve inside, and we have this giant puffy balloon of brocade, which is very fun. Once again, at the top of this, I'm going to kind of construct these sleeves entirely and then set them into the bodice. So at the top of this, I will again match my underarm seams, pin those together, pin up either side along the smooth sections of this sleeve, and then I will gather the sleeve cap down to fit the undersleeve. So the undersleeve is just my regular standard sleeve cap, and then the top of this has been puffed, so there's a little bit extra in the oversleeve. Again, I'll pin my centers together, like so. Forgot to mark those earlier, and then gather the outer sleeve down to fit the undersleeve. Hopefully you're following along. Honestly, my brain has been a bit fried after January. PMDD really came for me, as evidenced by the fact that I didn't even have a video last week here on the channel, because my progesterone / serotonin levels were not on being friendly last month. So I was really quite pleased when my brain started clearing of that level of fog. Sometimes it's fine, and sometimes it really gets to me. And this last month, it really got to me. So I'm feeling much better now, thankfully. The nice thing about it being PMDD is I know it's cyclical and it will go away. But even with medication, some months, it's not the best. So if any of you out there also have PMDD or are wondering why you get depressed for only 2 weeks out of the month, check with your doctor, honestly. Because I had no idea that was what was happening for the longest time. And now knowing is at least somewhat helpful. I'm going to go ahead and line my sleeve caps, by the way. I hadn't even cut any lining out for these, but I cut some out of some spare black silk taffeta. I do like to keep like at least a yard of black silk taffeta on hand, which is an expensive thing to keep on hand, but it is so good for lining little pieces like this, but also for using to make bias tape to hem stuff. And I'm always working with black, so it's very useful for me to have some black taffeta here in my studio. And after I sew those along the hem right sides together, I of course need to clip that curve, and then I'm going to actually throw some understitching in these just so that they stay folded underneath. The lining of it like stays folded underneath where it belongs once these are set on top of my sleeves and then into the jacket itself. So when I'm understitching, I'm basically just stitching the seam allowance all down to the lining side, so it's underneath my fingers as I do this, making sure that I'm stitching all the seam allowance down to the lining side of this. That way the lining rolls under once I have a final press of this in place. And back under the iron over here. Just make sure everything is nice and smooth and finished. For these little caps that I'm going to stick onto the top of my sleeves. And I will again baste everything together because I have the sleeve cap here, which is technically 3 layers. The brocade, the muslin interlining, and then the silk lining. And then I have the undersleeve and the 2 layers of the outer sleeve. So it's just too many layers going into my arm side up here. So once I had it all pinned together and layered properly, again, I'm lining up the centers first and then pinning this sleeve cap on using the pins that are already holding the 2 layers of sleeve that I already have going together. 3 layers of sleeve total, and many layers of fabric. I went ahead and basted all this because, yikes, you know? I didn't want any of these layers to move around or get pinched or puckered as I actually set this sleeve in. So here it is, kind of whip stitched and basted together. I basted it and then I whip stitched around the edges as well. So I like double hand basted these. This is one of those things where I was like, oh, I already have the pattern. This project will be so simple just to go ahead and make a new like cotton PK version of this bodice. And in the end, the fabric I wanted to use wasn't going to work, so I had to switch that up. And then the fabric I did end up using, I needed to interline. So like this project, much like its very large sleeves, ballooned to be larger than I had originally anticipated. So it took a little bit longer. Of course, because I had to cut everything out of muslin as well and do that interlining, etc. But I do think it's worth it in the end because, of course, jacket came out rather villainous, and I can never go wrong with more villainous garments in my wardrobe. It is the direction that I've really begun to lean into now that I'm here in my 30s. But just fitting that sleeve into the arm side, like so, taking it over here to the machine and arguing with everything to make sure that it goes in without extra puckers. I do like to keep my fingers like on one side, moving things around, like leaving the needle down in the seam and then readjusting everything as needed every inch or so if needed, just to make sure that things aren't getting puckered or sewn down where they shouldn't be. I really believe in adjusting while sewing an arm side and a sleeve cap together. And right now I have my other hand, my left hand is actually in between the layers underneath that fabric, so I'm like holding it, I don't know, any way I need to make sure that this goes well the first time and doesn't need to be unpicked and done again. I'd rather take my time and make sure nothing is getting stuck the first round, because doing it all again, even less fun. Now, because this will be fully lined, I am going to actually put some clips in my under arm side area here, and then I'm going to push all of the seam allowance of this into the sleeve itself using my tailor's ham, and then give this a nice good steam from the outside to help that seam allowance point outwards into the sleeve, just to reduce bulk in this area when I'm wearing the garment later. And here is my really quick and dirty shoulder padding that I'm going to throw in here. I don't know why I just didn't dig out some actual shoulder pads. I thought I wanted something slimmer, and I think it would have been easier just to throw actual shoulder pads in here. This is a couple layers of suiting wool that I have sitting in my like scrap basket here, and then I kind of fused them together with a piece of fusible interfacing, and then I'm just pressing these to have a little bit of a curve over my tailor's ham using steam. And this worked fine, but I think it would have been easier just to, if I was going to make custom shoulder pads, I should have taken more time. And if I wasn't going to make custom shoulder pads, it would have just saved me time. So I should have just grabbed my bag of shoulder pads and found the thinnest ones. But I think most of the shoulder pads I have are actually a little too thick for this project. So I made do. But speaking of lining, I hadn't even cut mine out yet. So I grabbed some pewter gray, sort of a dark, warm gray acetate lining from my stash here. This was a Mood Fabrics purchase. I try and keep gray and black lining, again, kind of on hand at this point because we all know how often I sew with dark colors. So, and the center front of this lining I will go ahead and interface just for a little bit more crispness at the front of my jacket, so things stay nice and smooth when I'm wearing it later. And again, just like the outside of the jacket, I need to put my notches around the bust for sewing this together, and otherwise it's really the same steps. It's the same pattern pieces and the same order of operations to put the lining together here. The only difference is that this sleeve for the lining is just the undersleeve. So it's just that little slim undersleeve that gets stuck inside, of course. And then I will finish that off along the hem, so you'll see that later. But yes, in general, just repeating everything over again that I just did in the outer fabrics in this thin, slippery acetate lining, like so. And I actually did have a spare HTV Oil Slick B, or a TCHB sitting around, so I just ironed that onto the inside in lieu of a label, you know, just for funsies. And with my lining constructed and my outer jacket constructed, I can go ahead and start lining them up to one another. I will kind of be bag lining this, but kind of not. I'm going to line up the entire neckline and outside front edge of this, and I will line up part of the hem, and then I'm going to do this first half all on its own and kind of sneak some understitching in here as much as possible so that I didn't have to do top stitching on the entire outside of this jacket. I did end up doing top stitching along the center front of this, but I didn't do it along the hem of the peplum this time. There were some areas where I was hoping to get away with just understitching. So I didn't bagline the whole thing all in one because it would have made understitching really irritating. So I did one side first, understitched that, came back, and did as many portions as I could, baglining this, but still leaving myself enough room open to get inside and do understitching. If you've ever done understitching and baglining, you know what I'm talking about. If you're new to this whole thing, you're like, what? It's really hard to explain and hard to see, like hard to film. Like it's not easy to film understitching into tight spaces because it's not easy to sew in there either. So it's not the most fun thing to do, and it's certainly not the easiest thing to film. Basically, I'm baglining this and then trying to understitch as much as possible. So I'm doing it in sections instead of bagging the whole thing at once, going like 1/3 at a time. And of course I need to clip my corners and curves before I can do any understitching or flipping this to the right side out, basically. So I'm clipping my curves here, give this a kind of cursory press, and then I'll go in there and do that understitching while the rest of the jacket is still open, which looks like this over on the machine, aka just a mess of fabric. So really you cannot see what I'm doing. But I promise I'm understitching the different parts of the jacket. You just, I mean, what's the point of filming that, you know? Yeah. Cinematography is not useful in this regard. It's probably easier to understand what I'm doing here by watching the original version of how I lined this bodice. The process is very similar. It's just I was going to top stitch that whole thing the other time, so you can kind of see what I'm doing more over there. But this one, with this understitching, made the whole process way more visually confusing. But I have the whole darn thing together at this point, with a couple of spots open along the outer edge where I was getting in there to do understitching that I need to pin closed and then hand slip stitch shut, just like you would with a pillow. And I actually need to hand slip stitch the hem of my sleeves as well. So I'll do that in a moment. But before I close up this lining, I needed to remember to put those shoulder pads in here. So I'm going to make sure that the straight edge of the shoulder pad sticks out about a 1/2 inch, the same like width as the seam allowance along the outer edge of my shoulder and where my sleeve and my shoulder come together. And then I'm just really loosely tacking these in here. I'm stitching them quite firmly along the seam allowance of the shoulder seam, and then I'm really super loosely whipping these along the seam allowance of where I sewed the sleeve into the arm side, just so that these stay in place, but they're not like, they're like floating in here slightly. Just not enough to float anywhere else. I want them to stay up here in the shoulder, but I didn't need to secure them in a very precise way. Again, hopefully that makes sense. Oh my, voiceover me has been on vacation, and we can tell because my brain may be free of bees, but the honey is still gumming it up, I think, unfortunately. But now I can go ahead and pin up all the little openings that I left while I was trying to bagline / understitch this jacket, get this lining in here. So close up the collar and then really give everything else a press as I go around. Just because it's understitched doesn't mean it's pressed into this pressed into submission yet, so I had to go ahead and do that. All along the outside edges of my jacket, poking out corners with a knitting needle as needed. Carefully, because you will stick that needle right through there. Knitting needles are still sharp-ish, you know. You could do damage to garments and people if need be. And if you're me, you certainly can do damage to knitting projects because I'm terrible at knitting. And then here at the sleeve hem, you can see I have already ironed the lining piece in on itself a 1/2 inch so that I can go ahead and line up these edges in this weird sleeve puff area. And then again, slip stitch the lining down to the undersleeve so that the undersleeve is no longer seen. I mean, I used a black waxed cotton poplin, so I mean, it can be seen. But having this, yes, one more layer of fabric in these sleeves does make it so that the seam up in between the sleeve and the jacket is encased in a lining, which makes it much smoother and nicer to wear. So it's worth it, even though this now means there are like 7 layers of fabric going on in these sleeves, which is excessive, especially for a like short sleeved jacket. And therefore, I mean, I guess my upper arms will be nice and toasty and cozy, and the lower part of my arm I better just put on a glove. If I wore this with opera length gloves, it'd be full coverage. But yes, here I am slip stitching that down together, and I'll slip stitch all the other openings as well. Then my last step for this, because it's mostly together at this point, is to go ahead and make a placket for the center front closure. I like to have a placket underneath. And this jacket, even though I have extra ease built into this pattern, because I am working with a puffier fabric this time and interlining it, it really isn't actually enough ease for using this thicker fabric. I probably should have added another 1/8 of an inch along the side seams or something to really accommodate a thicker fabric. That is really the only time I ever add ease, actually, is when I'm using thicker fabric, just because I don't love a ton of ease in my clothing. I'd rather be slightly uncomfortable and feel extra fabulous. I don't know. But I did go ahead with this placket and take the opportunity to just set my hooks and eyes down the front of this a 1/2 inch apart, like not exactly in the center, so that I could have an extra 1/2 inch in the front of this garment for a little bit of extra room, which is another reason why it's nice to close over a placket center front like this, because you can always, like if you need to change the size of this, have a little bit more wiggle room, as opposed to like putting buttons and buttonholes in. Then you can move the buttons, but doing it this way does give me a little bit of flexibility if I ever want to change up how much this closes in the front. I can always like eke it out a little bit. So in this version, I do have the placket showing a little bit more here along the center front. I just decided how long I wanted that to be. You can have a placket go all along the front opening of the jacket if you wanted to, all the way up along the collar if you want, but I have it start kind of like just above the bust and then go to the end of the jacket. I did end up throwing some boning in here as well, just steel boning because it's what I have on hand, even though it's rather overkill. But I put 2 pieces of steel boning in here just again to help keep the center front of my garment nice and smooth and structured. Especially in this like shiny black brocade. It looks like I'm wearing sparkle asphalt or something. It's almost a faux leather look in some lights, or like sparkly gravel, you know, kind of a vibe. So I wanted it to be nice and structured and smooth. And I'm going to layer the placket 1/2 inch under my center front opening here, and then I will just pin that into place, and I will top stitch through the top of the jacket down into the placket with like decorative top stitching that will also be structural because it will keep this placket in place. And the other side will line up like this, and I will put hook and eyes in the end. So I'll just start my top stitching here at the center front princess seam, so it like seems to come from a natural place, I guess, and then go ahead and stitch out to the corner, and then all up along the center front, a 1/4 inch out, which I felt made this top stitching look intentional and like part of the design as opposed to something that is structural and holding the placket into place. And I ended the top stitching here at the top of the garment along that princess seam as well, which did mean I needed to do the same sort of top stitching on the other side, even though the placket is not attached over there. And then of course my last step for this was to sew all my hooks and eyes on, and I actually did concentrate a few extra right at the waist to make sure this stayed close and didn't pucker open right at the spot of most tension over my waist. And here is my finished sparkly black lame brocade jacket. I'm trying to make it as daywear as possible here by pairing it with all matte things otherwise, including accessories, although the dramatically feathered hat probably doesn't really help to tone any of this down. And though the shoulders and structure of this jacket turned out rather dramatic, it does help lean into the rather villainous vibe, so if I ever need to play a villain in a Shakespeare play, I can just pull this out of my closet and I'll be ready to go. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!